dim corridors of wartime memory, there are files the world was never meant to see. Buried beneath layers of official denials, burned ledgers, and sealed archives, certain projects from the Second World War remain too disturbing to confront openly. The title stamped across today's declassified theme, 5 Disturbingly Hidden, Tom to projects that still terrify experts, is no exaggeration. These are not tales of battlefield heroics or familiar campaigns, but shadows etched into forgotten tunnels, frozen seas, and whispered agreements between uneasy allies. Imagine rusted locks on dusty cabinets deep within intelligence basements in Langley, Moscow, or London. Labels faded, but the danger still potent. Historians who have brushed against these secrets describe sleepless nights, quiet warnings, and sudden roadblocks from agencies that should no longer care. If these fragments are true, they reveal a war more desperate, more reckless, and more morally compromised than any textbook suggests. As you listen, remember, every suppressed project carries echoes that may still shape our fragile world. Engage with caution, question every certainty, and prepare to confront what official history tried to erase. Chapter 1. Classified Shadows Beneath Auschwitz Tunnels. Beneath the familiar ruins of Auschwitz, a darkness lingers that is absent from most historical records. Among the camp's many horrors, there exists a layer of hidden architecture, subterranean passageways carved out under the orders of SS engineers in 1944, at a time when the Reich faced certain defeat. These tunnels, sealed off before Allied forces arrived, were barely acknowledged even in Soviet field notes. Archival fragments, declassified only in the 1990s, refer to Projekt Nachtbrunnen, translated as Night Fountain, a chilling codename for a project suspected to involve mass water contamination on an unimaginable scale. The tunnels were first hinted at by survivors who spoke of labor details, being marched away at night, never to return. One Polish prisoner, later interviewed by British investigators, described hearing faint drilling beneath Crematorium 4, sounds dismissed at the time as normal construction. Yet when Soviet sappers advanced in January 1945, they discovered partially collapsed shafts lined with reinforced concrete and crude ventilation systems. Declassified GRU memoranda mention soldiers falling ill after entering the breached tunnels. The accounts describe a faint metallic odor and pockets of unknown gas, consistent with industrial chemicals or even early nerve agents. British MI6 intercepted scattered references to Nachtbrunnen in captured German signals. In a 1946 briefing, Major Harold Liddell Smith warned his superiors that IG Farben scientists had experimented with toxins stable in water supplies, designed to infiltrate rivers or reservoirs behind enemy lines. The materials found under Auschwitz, broken glass ampoules, corroded piping, and handwritten notes in chemical shorthand, were quietly removed by the Red Army and shipped to Moscow. Public disclosure was avoided, partly to prevent panic, and partly because both Allied and Soviet intelligence agencies saw strategic value in the research. By 1963, Polish construction crews attempting to expand a memorial near the camp reported disturbing findings. Geiger counters brought in for routine safety checks unexpectedly registered anomalous readings near a collapsed shaft. Officially, the anomalies were blamed on industrial waste from wartime activities, and the tunnels were resealed with concrete. Yet internal correspondence between Warsaw and Moscow, unearthed decades later, reveals an urgent directive to terminate excavation operations at Sector 7 immediately. Western intelligence analysts now speculate that experimental dispersal devices, possibly containing uranium salts or other radioactive traces, were stored in those lower halls. The architectural layout of the tunnels remains a mystery. A single Soviet reconnaissance sketch, declassified in 1991, shows 3 main corridors branching beneath Crematoria 2 and IV, converging on a central chamber marked X7. The chamber's function is unknown. Some theorize it was a storage vault for chemical agents or prototype pumps designed for contaminating nearby water systems. Others suggest it may have been a control center for distributing gas through underground pipes, an emergency plan if the main extermination methods were disrupted by Allied advances. Local villagers near Auschwitz have long circulated hushed rumors of sudden livestock deaths after the war, blamed on tainted wells. A retired Soviet medic interviewed in the late 1980s recounted that 2 of his fellow sappers developed severe respiratory damage after a tunnel breach, their symptoms resembling chlorine or phosgene exposure. His testimony, though unverified, aligns with other fragmentary reports that point toward the testing of chemical dispersal methods far from the front lines. Experts today remain divided. Some argue the evidence is circumstantial, pointing out that Germany's collapsing infrastructure in 1945 would have made such a grand-scale water contamination operation impossible. Others note the Reich's history of desperate last-ditch measures, V-2 rockets, jet fighters, and even plans for Alpine redoubts that suggest any atrocity was conceivable in their final months. Historian Dr. Anke Bauer of Munich University has described Nachtbrunnen as a potential doomsday lever, a plan to poison retreat paths, slow advancing armies, and terrorize occupied populations. The tunnels under Auschwitz were ultimately forgotten in official histories, overshadowed by the camp's far more visible atrocities. But the silence itself is suspicious. Why did both Soviet and Western intelligence redact entire sections of reports concerning subterranean structures? Why did post-war excavation efforts repeatedly stall due to unforeseen hazards? The absence of definitive answers leaves room for chilling possibilities. That remnants of chemical or radioactive devices may still lie entombed beneath the memorial grounds, or that intelligence agencies quietly repurposed Nazi research to refine their own Cold War arsenals. Satellite imaging in the early 2000s detected unusual ground disturbances near the southern perimeter of the camp, patterns inconsistent with natural settling. Polish authorities dismissed these findings as anomalies caused by soil erosion. Yet whispers among historians persist, suggesting that advanced ground-penetrating radar surveys were halted under government pressure. Citing respect for the sanctity of the memorial, skeptics counter that genuine concern for commemoration would not require suppressing non-invasive surveys. To this day, Project Nachtbrunnen remains a phantom entry in declassified indexes, listed but lacking detailed documentation. Even its name may have been chosen to mislead. The surviving evidence, Soviet sketches, damaged pipes, whispered survivor testimony, paints only fragments of a horrifying picture. A hidden infrastructure for chemical sabotage buried beneath humanity's most infamous killing ground. Whether those corridors still conceal lethal secrets, or whether the project was abandoned before completion, remains unanswered. The experts who have dared to investigate speak of an uneasy dread, a sense that some knowledge is too dangerous to fully expose. In the shadows beneath Auschwitz, history's buried nightmares still wait, silent and unresolved. Chapter 2: Forbidden U-boat convoy to Antarctica. As the Third Reich disintegrated in the spring of 1945, a handful of high command transmissions hinted at a final, desperate gamble. An exodus by sea toward a destination so remote it defied Allied pursuit. Among the most unsettling fragments is the story of a U-boat convoy, codenamed Operation Valkyrie II, which reportedly slipped from Kiel in April 1945, under orders signed by Gross Admiral Karl Dönitz himself. Unlike the evacuations of civilian refugees or wounded troops, these Type WWII U-boats carried sealed steel containers, their manifests deliberately falsified, decrypted Enigma traffic intercepted by British Bletchley Park cryptanalysts, referenced Südliches Endlager, or Southern Depository, a term never found in surviving Kriegsmarine. Orders, Argentine archives, long, sealed under military decree, contain hints that neutral harbors along the Patagonian coast were quietly instructed to expect special cargo under false flags. Two German subs, U-530 and U-977, did in fact surrender in Mar del Plata months after Germany's capitulation, fueling persistent rumors. But intelligence chatter suggested others turned south, slipping beneath the polar convergence into the uncharted Antarctic coastlines. In July 1945, a Chilean patrol vessel reported sonar echoes of an unknown submarine moving beneath heavy ice near the South Shetland Islands, yet no wreckage was ever confirmed. In the early 1950s, British survey teams operating under the Falkland Islands Dependencies Survey recorded finding an abandoned German weather station frozen into the coast of Queen Maud Land. Inside, they discovered remnants of radio equipment with serial numbers traced to Kriegsmarine supply depots, but no personnel, no journals, and no logs explaining its purpose. The discovery was quietly filed away in London, officially classified under Polar Reconnaissance, and only surfaced decades later through declassification requests. CIA analysts in 1958 revisited these, anomalies when Soviet reconnaissance flights began over the Antarctic interior. One memo marked top secret speculated that at least one Valkyrie II submarine carried experimental Wunderwaffe components, possibly parts of V-2 guidance systems or uranium ore intended for an unfinished German nuclear device. A section of the memo remains redacted to this day, suggesting more than mere speculation. The concern was not only what the Nazis had transported, but who might have recovered it after the war. Operation High Jump, the massive US Navy Antarctic expedition of 1946-47, led by Rear Admiral Richard E. Byrd, has long been a focus of conspiracy theories. Officially, a training and research mission, High Jump deployed 13 ships, 33 aircraft, and over 4,000 personnel to Antarctica, far more than required for routine mapping. Declassified Navy correspondence reveals a sense of urgency. Admiral Chester Nimitz approved the operation just months after scattered intelligence hinted at unexplored German installations beneath the ice. Byrd's own cryptic remarks too. Chilean reporters upon returning, warning of the possibility of hostile craft approaching the United States over the poles, only deepen suspicions. Skeptics argue that logistical challenges, extreme weather, and limited wartime resources would have made a permanent Nazi base in Antarctica impossible. Yet this overlooks the Reich's established interest in the continent. As early as 1938-39, the Schwabenland expedition mapped sections of Queen Maud Land, dropping aluminum flags marked with swastikas to claim the region as Neuschwabenland. Photographs from that mission show cavernous ice caves and geothermal anomalies that could, in theory, shelter small operations. The wartime development of advanced type of anti-wind submarines, capable of long-range, submerged travel, made such a voyage conceivable, even as Germany collapsed elsewhere. One particularly chilling clue lies in a 1952 Chilean naval report describing an encounter near Deception Island, a half-submerged wreck, partially encased in ice, bearing markings consistent with a Kriegsmarine U-boat. The boarding team found the interior stripped, as though its crew had deliberately removed logs, navigation charts, and identifying components before abandoning it. The incident was officially recorded as an unidentified derelict and classified, never released to the public until a Freedom of Information request surfaced a heavily redacted version decades later. Theories abound about the sealed containers Valkyrie II carried. Some historians propose they held technical blueprints, industrial diamonds, or stolen art bound for hidden caches. Others insist the cargo was far more dangerous: enriched uranium, rocket components, or even biological agents developed by units like 731 or Ahnenerbe researchers. The secrecy with which Allied and South American governments treated post-war U-boat surrenders lends weight to the notion that something more than art or gold was at stake. Cold War geopolitics further obscured the truth. By the late 1940s, the Antarctic continent became a zone of intense interest. The 1959 Antarctic Treaty eventually froze territorial claims, but not before multiple nations, Britain, Chile, Argentina, and the United States, rushed to establish research stations and conduct aerial surveys. Declassified British Admiralty memos show concern that Soviet agents were probing Queen Maud Land for potential German caches. Armani 6 Center. CIA cable even suggested a joint Anglo-American search had recovered non-specific metallic artifacts of German origin, but ordered silence to avoid public hysteria. Historians like Dr. Lena Forster of Hamburg University argue that the enduring secrecy may relate to advanced materials science. Nazi Germany had pioneered exotic alloys for jet engines and rocket guidance, materials decades ahead of their time. If fragments of such technology had been hidden in Antarctica, recovered by either superpower, acknowledging that fact would raise difficult questions about post-war technological leaps. Today, expeditions occasionally venture near the suspected sites, but official permissions are limited, citing environmental concerns. Satellite imaging has revealed strange linear depressions beneath Antarctic ice shelves, features some claim could mark collapsed tunnels or submarine pen entrances. Glaciologists counter that these are natural meltwater channels. Yet the debate refuses to die, kept alive by whispers among naval historians and declassified fragments hinting that not all Valkyrie II cargo was ever found. The convoy's ultimate fate remains officially unresolved. 2 surrendered U-boats in Argentina could be explained by rogue captains fleeing Allied retribution. But the others? Their absence gnaws at the edges of wartime history, suggesting an unfinished chapter hidden under miles of ice. If even a fraction of the rumors are true, it would mean that as Europe burned, Nazi Germany launched a final, audacious attempt to secure its deadliest secrets in the world's most inaccessible wilderness. A secret perhaps still entombed beneath the frozen Antarctic darkness, waiting for an age reckless enough to uncover it. Chapter 3. Erased Soviet-British Bioweapon Exchange Pact. Among the countless classified folders buried within Cold War archives, few revelations disturb historians as profoundly as the fragmented evidence of a wartime collaboration, known by the codename Operation Heathfire. The surviving documents, heavily redacted KGB memoranda, and cryptic British SOE reports indicate that in 1942, amid the bloodbath of the Eastern Front, Stalin's NKVD and Churchill's Special Operations Executive quietly arranged a secret exchange of biological warfare research. This pact, erased from official history, suggests that two embattled Allied powers, fearing annihilation, considered measures that violated every ethical boundary. The context was grim. By mid-1942, German armies had advanced deep into Soviet territory, threatening Moscow and the vital oil fields of the Caucasus. British intelligence faced the possibility of the Soviet Union collapsing, leaving Britain exposed. According to fragments found in KGB archives during the late 1980s, NKVD courier Alexei Borodin transported sealed containers aboard an Arctic convoy departing Murmansk. These were labeled as medical supplies, but allegedly contained cultures of hemorrhagic fever viruses isolated near Astrakhan. In exchange, British handlers delivered experimental aerosol dispersal devices, prototypes, developed at Portondown that could release pathogens over enemy positions or civilian populations. One British field report dated November 1942 describes a clandestine meeting in Arkhangelsk between Major John Whitmore of the SOE and Colonel Dmitry Sokolov of the NKVD. The report, stripped of context, notes only that operational parameters for Heathfire confirmed and delivery verified. The few pages that remain suggest that small-scale testing may have occurred on Vozrojdeniya Island in the Aral Sea, a location later infamous for Soviet bioweapons trials. Allegedly, livestock and prisoners of war were exposed to diluted agents to evaluate dispersal effectiveness. No surviving photographs or comprehensive test logs exist, only peripheral references in unrelated communications and the eerie absence of documents where they should exist. In London, a Cabinet War Office memo from early 1943 mentions unrecorded expenditures related to Arctic convoy escort security. This correlates suspiciously with the timing of the exchange. Historians who have examined this link, such as Dr. Sergei Volkov, believe British officials feared war crimes charges if the pact was exposed, especially after revelations of Nazi atrocities. Stalin's regime had its own reasons for secrecy. Soviet propaganda cast the USSR as morally superior to fascism, and admitting to bioweapon development would have undermined that narrative. The subsequent disappearance of key figures raises further questions. Borodin reportedly vanished during a 1946 transfer to Vladivostok. Major Whitmore's death in a supposed car accident in 1948 coincided with the earliest Western reports on Soviet biological weapons. Former NKVD officers interviewed in the 1990s spoke cautiously, suggesting that Heathfire's results were archived in closed facilities in Kirov Oblast or beneath Portondown itself. By the late Cold War, Vozrojdeniya Island was infamous for anthrax and smallpox testing. The island's sealed bunkers, left to decay after the USSR's collapse, still contain traces of dangerous pathogens. Independent researchers who have attempted to trace Heathfire's lineage through Soviet scientific papers report abrupt breaks in research continuity, a telltale sign of classified projects. Similarly, declassified MI5 files show surveillance of Portondown scientists in the 1950s suspected of privately sharing techniques first exchanged under Heathfire. The moral implications are staggering. Two Allied nations, celebrated for resisting Nazi barbarity, may have conspired to develop mass casualty weapons for use on European soil. Even if the plan was a contingency, its existence suggests that desperation pushed the Allies toward choices indistinguishable from the crimes they condemned. Cold War politics deepened the cover-up. Neither London nor Moscow could admit to such a pact without undermining decades of moral posturing. Instead, evidence was shredded, witnesses silenced, and operational names erased. In 1992, following the Soviet Union's collapse, Russian journalists uncovered references to Project Heathfire in a forgotten archive in Smolensk. Within weeks, access to the files was revoked. British officials denied knowledge, calling the claims speculative. Yet, a year later, an aging former Porton Down researcher, speaking anonymously to The Guardian, confirmed that experimental dispersal devices went east under Arctic escort in '42. He refused to elaborate, citing national security considerations. Even 50 years later, the implications of Operation Heathfire extend beyond history. Climate change is thawing Siberian permafrost, where old burial pits of anthrax-infected carcasses have already reactivated. If stockpiles of weaponized hemorrhagic viruses were buried or stored improperly, the risk of accidental release remains. Environmental scientists and military historians warn that fragments of this forgotten pact could still threaten populations today. That possibility alone justifies the lingering fear among experts, fear that the ghosts of a desperate alliance, forged in the bloodiest years of WWII, may yet haunt the present. The most unsettling element is not simply that Heathfire existed, but that it was almost entirely erased. The scattered evidence, the brief memos, redacted paragraphs, and whispered confirmations, speaks to a deliberate effort by two great powers to bury their most shameful compromise. The full story may never surface, but its shadow stretches across decades, a reminder that in the crucible of war, even moral lines meant to be absolute can vanish without a trace. To historians who have chased this phantom through archives and testimonies, Heathfire is not a closed case, but a warning. History's darkest truths are often hidden not by accident, but by design. Chapter 4: Disturbing Secrets of Unit 731 Relocation. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the world reeled at the revelations of Unit 731, the Imperial Japanese Army's covert biological warfare division. Stationed primarily in occupied Manchuria, Unit 731 conducted grotesque experiments: live vivisections without anesthesia, frostbite testing on prisoners, plague flea bomb trials on Chinese villagers. Official histories record these atrocities as ending with Japan's defeat. Yet declassified OSS cables and fragmented Marine Corps reports hint that some of Unit 731's personnel and research materials did not vanish with the Empire's collapse. They were quietly absorbed into post-war operations under a plan known only as Paper Lantern. Paper Lantern appears in a handful of US intelligence documents dated late 1945. One cable, marked confidential and addressed to Admiral Chester Nimitz's Pacific Command, describes a refrigerated transport rerouted via Guam, cargo priority redacted, under marine escort. Another, declassified in 1998, warns that Soviet forces advancing through Manchuria must not capture specific Japanese researchers. The implication is unmistakable. The United States, desperate to gain an edge in biological warfare against the USSR, moved select Unit 731 personnel to secret sites before formal occupation forces arrived. Accounts from Pacific Islanders on Palmyra Atoll, an isolated US territory, add another unsettling layer. In late 1947, island elders recalled strange medical detachments arriving by seaplane. They reported quarantines enforced with armed Marines and unexplained fevers sweeping through small communities afterward. Navy records from Palmyra that year are conspicuously thin. Routine maintenance logs exist, but medical logs are missing. Historian Dr. Ellen Cato, who investigated Palmyra's archives in the 1990s, noted entire file drawers labeled Health Records 1946-48 were empty, their card indexes removed. The US government's formal stance has always been denial, claiming all captured Japanese scientists were either prosecuted or repatriated. Yet documents from the International Prosecution Section of the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal show curious omissions. Key Unit 731 officers, including Shiro Ishii himself, were never brought to trial. Instead, Ishii was granted immunity in exchange for data on plague and anthrax dispersal methods. This much is now publicly acknowledged. What remains controversial is whether experiments continued under American oversight, transplanted to remote Pacific islands or underground labs far from prying eyes. A declassified memorandum from 1951 authored by an unnamed US Army Medical Corps officer, refers obliquely to lantern-derived hypothermia data, verified under controlled field conditions, Palmyra. No known authorized human experiments were conducted by the US military on Palmyra, leaving historians to speculate about who, or what, provided those field conditions. Some argue the memo merely referenced data analysis. Others believe Paper Lantern's relocation was not limited to documents, but included live subjects and ongoing testing. Cold War urgency provided powerful incentives for such moral compromises. The United States and the Soviet Union both scrambled to recruit Axis scientists. Operation Paperclip famously brought German rocket experts to America, while the Soviets captured entire V-2 teams. In the Pacific, Japanese expertise in germ warfare was equally coveted. The OSS cables suggest a calculated risk, shielding war criminals from justice to prevent the Soviets from gaining their knowledge. The victims, Chinese villagers, Korean prisoners, and possibly unsuspecting Pacific Islanders, were collateral in a clandestine arms race. Evidence also points to missing shipments of preserved specimens. In 1945, US Navy records logged at least 3 refrigerated transports departing Okinawa under classified orders. 2 were accounted for. One carried smallpox cultures to Fort Detrick, Maryland. Another transported influenza samples to a naval lab in San Diego. The third, whose manifest is redacted in surviving files, is absent from all subsequent tracking logs. Marine veterans interviewed decades later recalled guarding a mysterious cargo in Guam's Apra harbor. Sealed crates exuding a faint chemical odor, handled only by men in protective gear. The destination was reportedly Palmyra. By the mid-1950s, US biological warfare capabilities had expanded dramatically. Fort Detrick's anthrax and botulinum programs benefited from data so precise that independent verification was unnecessary. Historians like Sheldon Harris have argued that such precision could only have come from Unit 731's gruesome human experiments. Paper Lantern, if confirmed, would show that the transfer of knowledge was more direct and more active than previously admitted. Survivor testimonies from Manchuria add a haunting note. Several recalled Japanese officers boasting that America will thank us for our work. Others described frantic evacuations in August 1945, files burned, freezers loaded onto trucks bound for southern ports. Soviet forces did capture some personnel, leading to the 1949 Khabarovsk trials, but the most senior figures evaded prosecution. The tribunal records contain gaps where interrogation transcripts should be. Whether those men boarded American transports remains an open question. The Pacific Islands themselves keep their own counsel. Palmyra remains largely uninhabited today, its decaying bunkers and airstrips silent witnesses. Occasional visitors report strange medical debris buried in sand dunes, rusted syringes, broken glass vials with Japanese lettering. The US government offers no explanation, and environmental surveys are discouraged, citing contamination risks. The absence of definitive proof has not silenced suspicion, but amplified it, leaving Paper Lantern as one of WWII's most disturbing unresolved threads. The ethical stain of Paper Lantern, if fully uncovered, would force a reckoning. It would show that the Allies, like their defeated enemies, exploited human suffering for strategic gain. More chillingly, it would suggest that the line between justice and expediency blurred the moment victory was assured. For experts who have sifted through the fragments, OSS cables, missing medical logs, the whispers of islanders, the question lingers: what price was paid to keep Unit 731's secrets alive? Until the full truth emerges, the shadows of Paper Lantern continue to darken the legacy of a war already steeped in unimaginable horror. Chapter 5: Hidden German Nuclear Test. At Ohrdruf. In the chaotic final weeks of March 1945, Thuringia's forests concealed an event that still rattles nuclear historians. Aughrdruf, a Wehrmacht training ground near Gotha, became the rumoured site of a primitive German nuclear test, Project Hexenkessel, or Witch's Cauldron. Local villagers reported a blinding white flash and a column of smoke spiralling skyward, unlike any conventional explosion. Some claimed to feel a shockwave that shattered windows miles away. For decades, these accounts were dismissed as confused memories from a collapsing Reich. Yet recently declassified Wehrmacht field logs and captured SS correspondence point to an unsettling possibility. Nazi Germany may have tested a low-yield atomic device. The evidence begins with a March 4, 1945 entry in the diary of General Hans Kammler, the SS officer overseeing advanced weapons programs. Kammler noted cryptically, Hexenkessel preparations complete, final sequence imminent. US Army. Alsos mission reports from April 1945, obtained when Allied forces seized Thuringia, mention unusual radiation readings near Ohrdruf. Colonel Boris Pasch, head of Alsos, allegedly briefed senior staff on the anomaly, but the specific findings were redacted in final summaries. A surviving memo from Pasch, discovered in 1992 among CIA archives, states only, evidence of unconventional detonation observed. Recommend full suppression. Soviet geologists conducting surveys in East Germany during the early 1950s recorded isotopic anomalies inconsistent with known munitions. These boreholes were promptly sealed and the findings classified. When asked decades later, Russian nuclear historian Yevgeny Kuznetsov suggested the readings indicated subcritical assembly experiments, possibly using enriched uranium. Such a device would not have been a full-scale atomic bomb but a desperate, partial success, enough to terrify Allied intelligence and motivate immediate cover-ups. Eyewitness testimony deepens the mystery. In a 1968 interview, an elderly farmer recalled hearing an unnatural roar and seeing wildlife lying dead in the fields days later. Another villager described soldiers wearing protective suits, an unusual precaution for standard munitions. US Army units occupying Aughrdruf documented abnormal sickness among some troops assigned to secure the site, though official reports attributed this to poor rations and stress. Historians have long debated whether Germany possessed the capacity for such a test. The Reich's uranium enrichment efforts, centered on facilities in Haigerloch and Oranienburg, were believed too primitive to achieve critical mass. Yet documents captured from physicist Kurt Diebner's team reference a thin-walled reflector device and neutron initiators compatible with a low-yield detonation. If these components were assembled under Kammler's supervision at Ohrdruf, the explosion described by locals might represent a dangerous step toward nuclear capability. The strategic implications were profound. Had Germany successfully demonstrated even a crude atomic device, it might have altered surrender negotiations or emboldened extremist elements to prolong resistance. Allied forces, already racing the Soviets to capture Berlin, had every reason to suppress evidence that the Nazis were closer to nuclear success than the public believed. The Alsos mission's silence on Ohrdruf contrasts sharply with their detailed reporting on lesser German projects, suggesting deliberate omission. Cold War geopolitics further obscured the truth. Both Washington and Moscow had motives to claim sole mastery of nuclear technology. Admitting that Nazi Germany had achieved even a partial detonation would tarnish post-war narratives and raise questions about the origin of certain early Cold War breakthroughs. Declassified CIA correspondence from 1957 hints that intelligence officers revisited Ohrdruf's soil samples to compare isotopic signatures with US test sites. The results remain classified. Even modern investigations are hindered. In the late 1990s, German researchers petitioned for ground-penetrating radar surveys of Ohrdruf's restricted military zones, only to be denied by the Bundeswehr, citing unexploded ordnance risks. Independent geologists attempting unofficial measurements have reported faint anomalies, but nothing conclusive. The site remains an active training area, further complicating access. The moral dimension is equally unsettling. If Hexenkessel was real, it would reveal the Reich's willingness to unleash nuclear terror, even as its armies collapsed. It would also suggest that Allied intelligence absorbed valuable nuclear data from captured German programs, data that may have influenced early US and Soviet designs. Such a revelation would challenge the comforting narrative that the Manhattan Project stood alone at the dawn of the atomic age. Ohrdruf's forests today are quiet, their hills dotted with memorials to victims of nearby concentration camps. Yet beneath that silence lies a shadowed chapter. No official plaque acknowledges the village's testimonies of a flash or the sealed boreholes of Soviet geologists. Historians like Rainer Kalsch continue to argue for transparency, citing scattered documents and unexplained radiation readings. Government agencies, however, insist there is nothing to reveal. Until unrestricted access is granted, Ohrdruf remains a place where history and secrecy intertwine, and where the possibility of a hidden German nuclear test lingers, terrifying in its implications, unresolved in its evidence, and emblematic of the lengths to which powerful nations will go to control the narrative of the past. In the aftermath of these revelations, the silence becomes deafening. The 5 files, Nachtbrunnen beneath Auschwitz, Valkyrie 2 beneath the ice, Heathfire's erased Pact, Paper Lantern's hidden transfer, and Hexenkessel's blinding flash, form a mosaic of dread that challenges our understanding of the war we thought we knew. Each fragment is incomplete, yet together they suggest that the Second World War was not merely a conflict of armies, but a battleground of shadows where moral lines dissolved. Experts who have brushed against these secrets often speak in guarded tones, aware that some truths remain dangerous even decades later. Were these operations truly abandoned, or did their echoes seep into the Cold War's darkest corners? What hidden caches or corrupted data might still lie dormant, waiting for an unwary world to stumble upon them? The declassification of such files is never total. Pages vanish, witnesses disappear, and official denials persist. As you consider these disturbing projects, ask yourself, what else remains buried beneath ice, soil, or bureaucracy, forgotten until the day it surfaces to rewrite history once again?